So this is now the last video I'm going to be making at the Lviv Media Forum. The closing ceremony has just happened. It's been a huge privilege to be able to be here, have a fantastic facility to meet people, network and create new connections. But we are going to flip the tables a little bit. So I'm here with friend and colleague Alya, Shandra, who's been on the channel numerous times. I think many of you will be familiar with her extremely incisive and indeed passionate points of view on various geopolitical topics, especially Ukraine. But we're going to flip the tables and she's going to ask me some questions. This is her idea.
Yeah.
And it follows a conversation we had at the festival.
So I think the viewers of Silicon Curtain deserve to know who's the man running this show and why is he doing this in the first place? Why is he interested in such a distant country and such that is far away from the UK? So Jonathan, how did you get started with all of this Ukraine and Russia business?
Well, after hearing all this, I hope they still stick with the channel. It doesn't put them off. No, this started a long time ago, and actually some of these stories are kind of dribbled out on the channel. So some people who watch, who are tormented souls enough to watch, the videos daily will have a little bit of an idea. But no, it started a long time ago. When I was 14, I started reading Russian literature. We can come on to that because, of course, there's problematic aspects to that now. And when I was 15, I started studying Russian history. So for me, it wasn't just like the literature and it's all romantic and so on. Very early on, I studied the extremely traumatic aspects of Russian imperial history, but also the revolution. I spent a number of years diving into that. And of course, the sheer turmoil and brutality of the Civil War. Unusually, the teacher we had in my particular school, this wasn't on the curriculum, but we went into the Holodomor a lot. I can't quite recall in what sense it was taught. I do remember genocidal aspects, but of course in those days, and Russia invested a huge amount in not saying the Holodomor didn't happen, but saying that it was a crass struggle. It was emergent from the revolution, turning it into almost a political football, and that almost doesn't quite neutralize the topic because the horror still comes through, but it does actually take the edge off it and it confuses things. And it's only the realization of that manipulation of history, I think, that comes later. So my introduction to Russian literature was in parallel with the history. And I think that's the right way. Without context, then there is a real danger of romanticizing the whole thing about Russian 19th century history. You can't really romanticize the revolution. There's no way to cleanse that up, scrub that up to make it look romantic. But even then, there's a re-emergence of someone like Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago, and then a re-romanticization of what was a horrific period. I know a lot of people like that, but I found that to be one of the most tedious novels ever and strangely inauthentic. So there was the study of Russian, the interest in Russian. I will come to why in a minute, but just chronologically. So that was at school, and then I went on to do a degree in Russian language, literature and history. And then from 92, which was my first visit to Russia, through to 98, I must have spent about 3 years on and off living, studying, traveling in whatever you want to call it, Balochistan.
Okay, so you told me about your interest, that you started studying all of this, but why did you get interested in this faraway country? Yes.
Two reasons. One is to understand what seems to be the irrational course of Russian history, and just understand the scale of dysfunction, and trying to understand, well, how is that even possible? How did it come about? But the other aspect of it is to understand England, which people might think, well, hang on a second, what's inexplicable about England and Britain? But actually, I think the mechanics of democracy, the culture of democracy and law, the evolution of these things through the multiple sort of cultural and political revolutions actually is an extremely conscious thing, an extremely complex thing. And we're only half conscious in democracies of actually how democracies function. So for me, it was a way of, Russia is something where, it's changed now, but at the time in the 90s, it was a bit more optimistic. And it sort of felt to me like, if Western democracy is barely conscious and it's like a Swiss watch with all the mechanisms hidden behind a a pretty facade. You don't know how the hands tick. Russia is more like, you know, the patient who's on a slab having multiple organ surgery, and the anesthetic wears off halfway through and they kind of become aware. And that's how it kind of felt. But then if you juxtapose and compare the two, you can learn something about the West and you can learn something about Russia. It turns out that now is of far more existential and immediate interest. You know, Russia was, and by Russia I mean the wider Eastern Europe, became less geopolitically important, as it were. It became sort of, you know, it's doing its own thing, it's evolving, it's no longer the center of geopolitical activity. The Cold War's done, liberalism has triumphed, end of history, all that kind of stuff. And so the focus moves away. Now that struggle's become existential, I think, because democracy and all these values that we've sort of taken for granted, that we're barely even aware of how they exist and how they function and how they work, are now under attack from that very malignant force, Russia, which, you know, I chose to study, and now that seems to become super relevant.
So, did you uncover, what did you uncover in this quest to understand, like, why Russia is so messed up, and what did it mean for understanding the UK? Because of course, it's a far different evolution, and what you say about taking democracy for granted is very, very important, as we see the decay of democracy around the world, and people not understanding how privileged they are to live in this society that is democratic and free. So did you uncover, like, what did you find out?
Well, let's stick with sort of motivations before we go on to that, because I think it will help to answer that question. The wall came down, you know, I was watching the news already during that process. I travelled to Berlin in 1990 and, you know, went to a Pink Floyd concert on the site of the Berlin Wall. So this all felt very immediate, and I was already very aware of the historic events, you know, taking place, because I'm you know, far more ancient perhaps than I look. But you know, that seemed extraordinarily important, I think. But what I was looking for was some kind of emergent property in Russia, right? This tyranny has fallen apart, and I wanted to see, is there going to be some emergent culture, some organic kind of culture, some resurgence of music and art, and you know, what's going to be released when that pressure is lifted. But that, of course, is to look at things wrongly, because Russia, and I don't think I quite realised it to that extent, is an artificial construct. It's an imperial construct, and it's always been built from the top down, never from the bottom up. So that emergent, bottom-up, organic sort of emergence of culture, I didn't think happened. And I searched in vain for evidence of it. Where I should have come, of course, is Kiev. I should have come to Ukraine, because that's exactly where that sort of culture has emerged. Not just you know, visual culture, literary culture, but political culture as well. And it's only in the context of the full-scale war that I realized I was looking in the wrong place for these things.
What did you discover in Ukraine?
So I discovered, I mean, one is a sort of parallel perhaps to certain periods of English history. Now, there are certain periods where these democratic behaviours, cultures really formed. But of course, in England, they're more than 3 centuries ago. We have to go back to, you know, the Civil War period, the extraordinary emergence of ideas, the battle between, you know, Parliament and the monarchy. And whereas some of these ideas weren't necessarily triumphant, and we reverted back to a you know, a limited monarchy. Certainly, if you look at the sort of discussion of ideas, including socialist ideas in some form, this incredible explosion of human energy and chaos, it's centuries ago. So we find that there's these interesting parallels between Ukraine, and Ukraine's multiple revolutions are part of that same struggle, but in modern times. So I think you're more acutely aware of one thing, which is the tyranny of not just Soviet dictatorship, but also the tyranny of a highly bureaucratic architecture tyranny of a system that relies on a very vertical, nepotistic and corrupt system, and you're still trying to break out of that, if we're honest, but also some of those sort of Soviet highly managerial properties are running rampant in the West. The lack of leadership and these kind of things. So I think that's one of the key things. But the realization that Ukraine is in this process of this extraordinary, multi-layered kind of revolution, trying to look at Western values, but not just slavishly copying, trying to take things that are intrinsically going to function better here and take the best of some of those Western values, but do it in a particular Ukrainian way. And that's absolutely fascinating, but also juxtapose that with the fact that these things have not emerged in Russia. They do not really exist amongst the Russian opposition. There's very little trust, there's no cooperation. In fact, I don't subscribe to this idea of good Russians, bad Russians. That's a completely unhelpful concept. I think more of useless and useful Russians is a maybe better concept. And unfortunately, the majority, and this isn't a moral judgment, it's more a political judgment, and in the majority, vast majority, 9.9999% fall into the useless category. That doesn't mean they're not well-meaning or whatever, they're just functionally not, there's no trust, there's no organization, there's no strategy, and in some ways there's not enough understanding of their own society to bring around radical change. I think that's a long journey, but this is the kind of realization I've come to, that what Ukraine has got and what Ukraine now is it's the bleeding edge, the bleeding frontier of Western values to which we have great commonality, and this experiment which we need to learn from and get some of that Ukrainian energy back into us so we can actually become more conscious of our own democratic values to protect them. But you're on the bleeding edge of actually of a society that doesn't have any of the elements, and we need to be aware that if we don't build a wall, Game of Thrones style, we have to hold something that's very toxic and dangerous at a considerable distance from Europe.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a fascinating thing right now, that when the bureaucratic pressure fell down from Russia, nothing emerged to replace it because Russia is an artificial entity. And a thought came to me that perhaps this is the reason why it needs its imperial expansion, why it needs this external image of an external enemy, that is like the evil West that is attacking Russia, because that is, if there is no pressure, if there is no enemy that the Russians need to resist, then it all falls apart, because there is no unifying concept of who are we. So basically am I correct in understanding that Russians right now, they describe who we are as an entity by, we are those who resist the external enemy?
I think that's a useful thing. We also have to remember there's a high degree of passivity in all this. There's going to be a small percentage, and estimates from the many experts that I've interviewed estimate that somewhere between sort of 15-20% or so come under the category of Z patriots. And I think these people actively think about the imperial construct. They think about how to dominate others, how to export their particular spiritual concept to the world, which actually is a power structure. There's nothing spiritual about it, but how to export this authoritarian values and gain power and so on. And there's a small percentage, again, 10-15%, who are really quite opposed to what's happening, and almost certainly opposed to the war. Primarily don't want to participate in the war, we know that, but as a secondary we'll say, okay, it's not a good thing, and they may not have the sort of empathy we would like for Ukraine and its struggle. It may be just seen through their own personal trauma primarily. That's one of the Russian problems essentially, is that lack of empathy within their society and externally to others as well. But there's a substantial proportion who will understand this is a bad thing. But even within us, and then the rest is just like, just leave me alone, I don't do politics. I'm just going to survive and struggle and do my thing. But even then, I think there's an overarching desire amongst the majority of Russians, includes some of the problematic opposition, that a unitary Russia Russia as an entity surviving whatever we're going through at the moment ultimately is a good thing. Whereas most Ukrainians would say, well, hang a second, if there's going to be peace and security in Europe, that's fundamentally incompatible with a Russia that survives, even if it's, we're not talking about Ukrainian sovereign territory, it's still an imperial entity. It's still, as you say, very unwieldy. It still requires, a guy at the top with a very big stick to hold it together. But most Russians will generally say, okay, well, that's, it's a bad thing to want that to fragment and disappear and become something other than it is. And that desire is fundamentally incompatible with peace, democracy and security. Because of that inherent instability, it will always need enemies. Mm-hmm. But, this would be when I'd fire back at you. I'm not, politically, I'd say I'm sort of bang in the center. Some Americans would think I'm a bit of a, lefty kind of thing, but I'm not. I'm in the sort of center. I'm very pro-capitalism. It will form of managed capitalism, as it were. But I think we can't understand the power of vertical often, and many of the speeches we've sort of and events focus on the political manifestations, but that's almost looking at the symptom of Russian authoritarianism and not looking at the disease. We look at Dugin and all these clown figures. We look at Putin without looking at what's really behind him. We talk about the oligarchs and the media and the disinformation. These are all surface symptoms of something which maybe it's more helpful to look at it from a more Marxist point of view, which is this all comes down to resources. Yes, the empire is unstable, but why do you need an empire in the first place? You need it to be able to extract the resources to maintain the vertical. The vertical maintains the empire. I think there's a fundamental economic foundation to the whole structure. And indeed, the whole imperial construct is a way of holding it together so you can extract the resources. 80 to 90% of the wealth of those resources ends up in Moscow. It's a tumor. It's a parasitic entity, a self-perpetuating one. And the culture and everything else are just tools to hold that stuff together. It's not a industrial or even post-industrial. It's a pre-industrial. It's an extractive mindset. It's a very simple, basic economic model, which is basically dig stuff out of the ground or chop things down, or if you go back to the sort of, the 17th, 16th century, it's get mink and coats and fur. It's an entirely extractive, not a value-added thing. You don't need a legal system. You don't need trust. You don't need really complex logistics to maintain the wealth of the elite that maintains that power structure. All you need is an army to suppress internally. You need to expand so that you have some control and penetration of the markets where you can put your stuff into. Because you don't have a strong legal basis and value add, you need to interfere in other countries because you have to maintain an unfair competitive advantage. You have to make sure there's still a market for your commodity to maintain your elite structure. And what do you need? You need a secret service to suppress any dissent. The majority of the Russian population is superfluous to requirements, because in order to produce the wealth that keeps the elite going requires a small percentage of the population to actually extract those resources and the monetary value. Obviously, you need a much bigger army and a much bigger secret police to hold that together. But even then, it's going to be less than 10% of the population maintains the economic model. Whereas in Europe, and to an extent in America, you need a much broader involvement of your population to keep the economic model going that sustains your political hierarchies and elite. I think that's one of the fundamental problems that we just ignore over and over. We look at the symptoms rather than the underlying cause.
And at the same time, there is a sort of sacralization of this model of power in Russia, because, of course, freedom is perceived as something that is an enemy to the existing status quo. And if this existing status quo collapses, then it will be catastrophe. So
that's right.
Basically, it's a self-perpetuating system, because the alternative is unthinkable, right?
Yeah.
And that is very different from what we see in Ukraine. And you mentioned something very important, is that there is a spark going in here, something very passionate, a very passionate defense of freedom that is going on, that the West would be prudent to rediscover.
Yeah.
Could you tell more about that? Why you think there is this spark here that the West maybe forgot?
I think I'll come to that first. One, just close out the previous point. I think it's fascinating. One of these, I'd class him as one of the useless Russians, but many in the media would class him as one of the good Russians, to use that different framing. Vladimir Kormorza, for instance, did a recent interview on Channel 4 in the UK where he got actually very, very angry at the suggestion or the hint that Russians may be genetically incapable of democracy. And he got very angry, and the politics of resentment is a powerful thing. But he said, I hate it when I hear this from Western journalists, where the implication that we're not capable of democracy. And I'd say, well, hang on a second, that idea hasn't come from us. That is a primary idea of the Russian security services. That's what they want Russians to believe. We're just mirroring back what I've heard numerous times from many, many Russian colleagues, associates, friends, etc. And it's very deeply embedded. And of course, they're going to want their population to believe that because they don't want agency organization. Then there's the fundamental difference. And many Russians will choose security and certainty and even, a terrible life, but just leave me alone over freedom and democracy. Ukrainians seem to have a completely different mechanic, which is what makes it, I think, fascinating, which seems to be an almost instinctive cultural distrust of authority, an absolutely stubborn contrarianism. They don't want to be told what to do. And many Ukrainians that I've had the privilege to get to know the last couple of years, they're kind of allergic to the sense that anyone might be influencing them and controlling their actions. If they feel some authority is, you got to do this, and it may be the right thing to do, but I'm not going to do it because someone's told me that I should be doing that. I think that's actually a very kind of interesting and healthy thing, and of course it can lead to all sorts of chaos. There's this anecdote where you have 2 Ukrainians in a room and 3 hetmans kind of emerge. Yeah, of course there's going to be some kind of a chaos and froth and inefficiency. But I think that distrust of authority, not turning your leaders into saints and icons, at its best extent, it's also not giving into nihilistic apathy and despair, but actually saying, okay, things are screwed up and there are all sorts of problems, but I'm not going to wait around for some authority to fix it. And I'm not going to, get resentful and complain and whine and point fingers. Well, there are plenty of people who still do that. But there are enough people, the threshold of people who say, do you know what? I'm not going to rely on government to solve this problem. I'm going to go out and solve this problem. And if no one solved this problem before, well, I'm going to go and figure out a way to do it. And I think it's that embracing of self-organization, responsibility, accountability. And again, you'll probably say, okay, there's a lot of people who don't do that. But if you reach a critical threshold of people who do, and if those values are maybe more concentrated in certain places, what I think we've seen in Ukraine is that with the decentralization process after the kind of Maidan, Revolution of Dignity, then actually these behaviors, they kind of propagate and people can learn them and be inspired by them. And that's, that starts to sort of blow away the torpor of what you have in Russia, which is a generations old cynicism and nihilism, and a sense that, well, why do something? Because agency, it's not going to change anything. It's all the same. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. And we're coming full circle to what we started from, is that you went to understand Russia, to understand the UK. And in the UK, as I understand, the thinking that underlies your entire socio-political system, it's also of agency, it's also of people who once upon a time organized to solve problems. Is that correct? What did you learn from your journey to Russia and back?
I think there are different mechanics there, and they're kind of interesting mechanics as well. In England, of course, we have quite a class system, which is we can describe it in simplistic ways, but there's some interesting complexities underlining it, and a very distinct sort of working class identities, and upper class and middle class, and actually there seems to be in some ways a strange commonality between working and upper class. They understand each other and their positions in the system more, whereas it's often a lot of middle class people who don't quite know where they fit in, and they're constantly struggling to define and redefine it, or aspire to be up here. Or even, when I was going to university, a lot of middle class people would aspire to be working class identities, and they change their accents, and they're going to get into football and like working class things, and so there's a discomfort, I think, in the middle class, which you kind of don't get in the upper and lower classes. Far more often, and these are huge generations, but far more assured of their identities. But I think a lot of the institutions, a lot of the mechanics of democracy emerge from the sort of frictions and interactions of classes, rather than just being purely sort of emergent properties here, which feels far less class bound. Yes, education plays a role, and there is certainly a kind of intelligentsia and so on, but I think there's sort of different, slightly fresher mechanics here.
So more egalitarian, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
You can come up, like Zelenskyy, you can come up from a small town or whatever in the provinces to become president and so on, and you're not necessarily held back by background, accent, and so on. These things, I think, class can be quite useful, especially when you're emerging from monarchical system. Actually, I think these are important mechanics in distributing power and not having power. And I know it's all a lot more complex than I can kind of express here, but I think classes are potentially quite a powerful force in the emergence of British democracy, which, remember, at the time, when we think now of European democracy under threat, and there's Russia, if we think back to the time of the emergence of sort of British political culture, newspapers and satire in the 18th century, I mean, it's a tiny little drop in an ocean of autocracy and monarchy, and that must have felt far more fragile in some ways. But also, if you look back at the sort of satirical art and whatever of the time, it's also far more boisterous, it's far more crude, and a lot more energy and passion and conflict. So I think these are all absolutely fascinating things to kind of look at. What I feel is that sort of energy and that consciousness that went into the struggle over a couple of hundred years to build democratic institutions and culture, from really the post-Cold War period onwards, we've become less aware of what it takes to be free, and freedom's been an assumed thing, and we just work less hard on the institutions. We've also allowed things like oligarchic ownership of media, penetration of our own oligarchs and indeed Russian and other foreign oligarchs. We've allowed that penetration of our systems to, I think, in some ways sort of corrupt and degrade our political dialogue. But we have our own, internal issues, nepotism. I tend to think that corruption gets all the focus, but actually nepotism is far more damaging, and promoting people based on personal connections or even, class definitions of being group. If you start systematically promoting people beyond their skill set because of who they are, then yeah, your society starts to go into a kind of first a stasis, and then it starts to kind of decline. And from the sort of 60s, 70s onwards, we've seen the movement from a much more egalitarian, energetic society in the 50s, and then that started sort of, we reached a peak, and we started to go down from a sort of meritocratic to some fairly but these aren't sort of seismic processes. It's a much far slower, gentler process of multiple little revolutions kind of going on, which is why studying Russia and Ukraine, I think, is interesting, because the revolutions are far bigger. Again, we come back to the patient on the slab. You can kind of see things happening. The watch face is ripped off, and you can see the mechanisms at work, and that's that's kind of interesting, I think, if you're contemplating these kind of questions.
Right. And to finish up, why is it important that the West regains the spark?
Because I think the spark and freedom, I think, is a sometimes too broad a concept. So I kind of quite like the Ukrainian concept of volia as opposed to freedom. Freedom not just as an abstract, or whether it's limited or unlimited can get you into sort of difficult areas, but the idea of volia, exercising your will and agency, and that not necessarily limiting the will and agency of other people, but finding a way to do that. I think that's a far more interesting kind of concept. I think we've lost some of that, if indeed we ever had something that equates to Ukrainian concept of that. But I think we need to relearn that in order to re-energize our democracies. And of course, they are now under attack on multiple levels. The Russian divide and conquer is now amplified through social media. That's why my channel's called Silicon Curtain. The Iron Curtain isn't just a physical place on a map now. It's a battle taking place in every pocket, everywhere in the world, of people who have devices with a silicon chip. That's where the new frontier of freedom versus unfreedom is. But there's other concepts when people talk about democracy and freedom and so on. These can be abstract concepts, and I think actually there are some other ones which are less well treated, which actually are the underpinnings of democracy that we need to actually reconnect with. That would be trust, agency, volia or will or volition. And come from business, I think volition is an interesting one. Because societies that reach stasis, you may feel that's a good place to be stable. Stasis is not
developed democracy.
Yeah, developed democracy. You're balanced. It's like it's not. But actually, business teaches me. Well, being in business teaches me that actually, if you're in a company that's got that kind of stasis, that company is already on the decline. Because there's no such thing as status quo. You're either growing and evolving, or you're declining. And there is no standing still. It's just, you may not be aware of it, but you're already on the downward slope. And actually, if that gains momentum, it can be unstoppable. Then you have systemic collapse. And in an individual company, that's fine, because that company goes bust, and competition means there's other companies that can fulfill that. But when a society reaches the point of stasis, then that's extremely dangerous. And Ukraine is a society, I think, that's on the upward slope, full of energy, making lots of mistakes, experimenting, and unfortunately, Britain and Europe are either in a period of stasis, but the decline phase, which we're already in, we can pull out of it, but now it is being accelerated by the malicious intent of autocracies. They want that collapse to speed up. And I think they're more aware of it, unfortunately, than we are. I know it's a Russian trope that decadence is defining feature of the West, and they mean decadence in a very different way. They're sort of pseudo mystical, religious, traditional values, but that's just nonsense. But certainly, if a society doesn't have energy and isn't moving forward and gaining momentum, then it's doing the other thing. And I think innovation cannot happen without all these things coming together. And if we cease to innovate, either democracy or technology, then we won't tackle any of the world's problems, physical problems with greenhouse, etc.
So, thank you so much. Let's take a moment to wish all the viewers of Silicon Curtain that they find the volia to move forward and to advance democracy wherever they are.
Alya, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.